Hi, I'm Rahul Chandwani, and let's get started with this chapter. So, in this video, I want to talk about composition. Since most of our concepts are presented in a 2D frame, how we compose our shots is super important in telling a story. The point of knowing how to compose an image properly is to guide your viewer's eye through your image by creating harmony between shapes, values, and colors. By composing a shot well, you're telling the viewer not only what to look at, but also what to feel while looking at your artwork. There's no real rule that you have to follow in composition, but there are definitely things that work and don't work. So, throughout this video, I'll be talking about some of the things that I keep in mind when it comes to making good compositions. The first one being graphic shapes. So, a lot of the time, what makes a good composition is how well it reads graphically. This just means that you can break your image down into basic shapes and still understand what's going on in the image. The key is to play with light and shadow or overlapping lighter and darker values to highlight what you want and create pleasing shapes that have a good read as a whole. Generally, you can check if your image has a good graphic read by breaking it down into just two values, black and white. In Photoshop, I'll generally do this by adding a threshold layer to my artworks. What this does is it forces you to look at the image in a really simple way, since it's literally just two values, which makes it super easy to see if the image still holds up. You want to make sure that graphically, even with just two values, you're creating shapes that are clear to read and pleasing to look at. You want to make sure that you're creating a good balance of shapes that lead your eyes to the focal point and that the focal point itself stand out. With this piece, you can see that the shapes created by the shadows of the objects are all generally guiding your eye towards the center. They are all mostly pulling you into the artwork and pointing you towards the focal point. Also, the focal point itself is silhouetted against the lighter background. It's a simple way of seeing that on a very basic level, you can still see what's happening in an image, even though you're not seeing any of the details. This doesn't just have to work with more of a direct lighting scenario. It could also work with something that's more in an evening setting or something that's more low contrast like this one. Even if I break this down into just two values, you can still see the focal point on the top right clearly silhouetted against the bright background, and the character also on the left as it's overlapping with a lighter value behind it. So when I'm making my images, I'm just consciously making sure to create overlap between dark and light shapes, especially in areas I want to call attention to. Even in this piece here, you can see that if we break it down into just two values, it still gives you pretty much the same information without any of the details. You can tell that there are two rock-like shapes that are clearly being silhouetted against the lighter background, and other bright shapes that are all creating these interesting lines that are balancing out the whole composition. Graphically, this piece is still readable and generally creates a good balance of shapes throughout. Think of it like graphic design. Like if you had to create a good balance of dark and bright shapes in your canvas and create shapes that clearly tell you what's happening in the scene. This is not a rule that you should definitely have to apply to every artwork, but I've noticed for me it works most of the time. And it helps as something that I fall back on if I'm ever lost on the readability of my images. So the next one is leading lines. Every image, if you notice, is basically just made up of a bunch of lines and curves, whether it's through elements that stand out in color or lighter values interacting with darker ones. Once you start to see your image as just a bunch of leading lines, you can change your perspective to how you add any new element to your composition. Start to see everything you add to your image as a composition tool, a tool you can use to help guide the viewer's eye through the painting. You can create leading lines by obstructing the viewer's eye and creating shapes that the eye wants to follow. Knowing this, you can be a lot more intentional with every decision you make. So back to this artwork, you can see how I've intentionally placed objects to point towards my focal point, kind of creating this effect of pulling you into the image. Even the negative spaces I've left are creating areas of rest that take you throughout the composition. Even when I'm placing elements like birds in the sky, I'm thinking of how they can create lines that take you back into the focal point. Even in this painting, I've placed the rocks going from the foreground on the left, kind of taking you through the whole painting and to the focal point. Even the clouds in the sky bring you back down to the sand dunes in the background that are then pointing back into the center of the image. Even when I'm adding elements like rain in my scene, like in this artwork, I'm thinking of how it can make this flow of lines that bring you down towards the character, and then lines that are created with the dots that take you back into the background. I'm even making sure that the wires in the background are bringing your eye back into the painting. Think of it like you're creating these invisible lines that circle around the painting, taking you through every part you want to see. These are just a few simple examples, but lines literally exist everywhere in your image. So the next time you're adding something into your scene, try and be intentional with how you place them. Okay, framing. When you're making an image, you only have a limited amount of real estate in your canvas. So the amount of space you give something in your frame plays a huge role in how the viewer will feel about it. You can tell a story or emphasize the importance of certain objects in your scene based on how you frame them. Giving something more room in your frame automatically highlights its importance. So let's take a look at this image, for example. I wanted this image to be about the exposed blast furnace in the center, purposely allowed the furnace to take up most of my frame, while everything around it is just acting as supporting elements meant to guide your eye to the focal point. This gives the furnace a lot more importance in the scene and is dominating most of my canvas. But you'll see that if we change the angle a bit, in this one, it takes up a lot less space. It's a trade-off because although the furnace is still in the main focus, we've lost the sense of importance. This version seems almost more to tell a story that's about the character and his journey in this environment. So you see how you can tell a different story just by how you frame things. Also, sometimes what you choose to leave out of the frame can be just as important as what you show, especially in environment focused artworks. Everything about how you tell a story is in how you frame things. Often, a struggle with 3D is that you want to show everything you've made and every part of the scene, but it's important to still think like an artist when you're working in 3D. Art is all about evoking emotions in your viewer's mind. What you choose to show and how you show it is a conscious decision you have to make on your part. So, like in this painting, I've intentionally left the top of the structure out of the frame. That gives it more of a sense of scale and mystery in this piece. Okay, contrast. You might think of contrast as only the relationship between dark values and light values, but contrast exists in many forms. Contrast can be achieved when opposite elements are placed together, often to highlight the importance of one over the rest. This is a great way for you to make or give more attention to your focal point or make some elements stand out over the others. Contrast can exist in many forms, like contrast in scale, textures, details, shapes, forms, etc. So, like on the top left, I'm creating contrast by intentionally putting the brightest part of my composition behind the circle, which highlights it clearly. In the top right, I've put a bunch of tall rectangles and then placed a pyramid in the background. This way, I'm creating contrast using shapes. The pyramid, clearly being so different from the repetitive rectangles, automatically takes your eye towards the pyramid. In the bottom left, although all the shapes are just rectangles, your eyes would mostly go to the one isolated on the right. That's because on most of the left, you have these repetitive overlapping shapes, and then this calm space on the right, which is one isolated shape, creating contrast in detail. On the bottom right, I'm creating contrast with colors, while most of the composition are in these cool neutral tones, making the circle a warm tone automatically calls attention to it. I've done a similar thing in this artwork. I've made most of the foreground and midground into these tall rectangular pillars, and then just placing these pyramids in the background, which is contrasting in shapes to the rest of the image. I've also intentionally made the background have this dusty orangish fog, which is a complete contrast to the rest of the cool tones of the image. Okay, so I think this is one of the most important principles I keep in mind when I'm making pretty much any decision in my artworks. When you have a bunch of shapes to play with, it's generally a good idea to group them in a way that creates big, medium, and small shapes in your composition. Generally having one large shape, then a bunch of medium and small shapes that take up less space. So let's say I only have three elements to play with in my scene, two trees and a house, and I had to arrange them to create a pleasing composition. It's much more pleasing to the eye if I arrange them like in the bottom, creating big, medium, and small shapes, rather than what we have on the top, which is just three equal size shapes, which is kind of boring and flat to look at. You can also use this principle to create a sense of scale between your objects. So for example, if I have one cube in a frame, like in the top, there is no indication to how large or tiny this cube is. But if I add some cubes around it that are of various sizes, now we can start to get an indication of the size of the original cube, as we're now seeing it in relationship to these other cubes of different sizes. You can only tell scale when it's in relation to other things in its surrounding. I'm always thinking about this whenever I'm placing any kind of objects in my scene. The idea is to create a good balance between your shapes. Everything in your artwork are just a bunch of shapes and lines, so I always try to be really conscious in how I'm placing them in relationship to each other. You can have great designs, but how you place and present them in your composition can be the difference between an interesting or really flat, uninteresting artwork. When I'm thinking about placing these shapes, I'm also thinking about it kind of like a weighing scale, where I need to balance the weight of the shapes throughout my canvas. Where if I have a heavy shape on one side, I need other shapes on the extreme end in order to keep the balance of the composition. It's definitely a visual thing that you need to get used to over time, but with practice, hopefully, you can keep this principle in mind. Composition is a never ending topic that I feel that you can never really master. It's a really deep rabbit hole with endless things to learn. But I think that if you keep these few principles in mind, I'm sure you can create pretty good compositions that work really well. That's it for this chapter. I'll see you in the next one.